I had two back-to-back games this week where the same endgame theme came up and actually was the deciding factor in both games. So I thought maybe what I would do is when I have these kind of things come up in my games is I would make some short endgame videos, especially when they're simple endgames, but the correct application of them makes a difference between a win and a draw, or saves you half a point or something like that. So the the end game that I had come up this week, and this was in back-to-back games, and I will show those two games after I kind of go over the general ideas of this simple end game, and we'll see them actually applied in actual games. But what it is it's a king and rook pawn against king. And the idea is actually pretty easy on these. One thing is we study end games, you'll find out that having a rook pawn instead of a center pawn can be a disadvantage for the side with the extra pawn. And it's important to know some of these exceptions to the general rule. So as you can imagine, if this was a non-rook pawn, this would just be an easily winning position for white. They could just get their king out in front of the pawn and escort it down the board. But this case is a different story. And if we look at this position here, the outcome of the game depends on whose move it is in this position. If it's white's move, they will win. And if it's black's move, white cannot win. And so in these king and rook pawn endgames versus just a lone king, I got the key squares highlighted down here. And the important thing to know is that if black can keep white from occupying one of these two squares, or if black can occupy one of these two squares himself, then he can hold a draw in this position. So let's just see what happens if it were white to move in this position and how white would win. So basically what white would want to do is to get his king to one of these two squares. And of course it has to be he has to be able to get his king to one of those two squares and be in a position where black cannot capture white's pawn, of course. Then all bets are off. So let's just look at how this endgame would go. White would sprint towards one of these two squares. And notice how white shoulders out the black king here. And just jumps to one of those two squares. And now you see black cannot catch the white pawn. And the white pawn will just push through and become a queen. So that's how white tries to win these positions. They want to occupy one of these two key squares in a position where the pawn cannot be captured. So let's look at the same position with black to move. So black is going to rush to get to one of these two squares. So they're going to take the most direct path to get there. And you notice, because black controls b7 here, white cannot go on that square. So what's going to happen is black will draw in one of two different ways, and we will look at both of those. If white, so basically when we get to this kind of position, eventually white has to make a choice as to whether they're going to just try to keep pushing their pawn up the board, or if they're going to try to play like king to a7 here and keep black off of these two squares. Because if black can just get on one of them squares, it's drawn for sure. There's nothing to think about. So one of the drawing techniques for black is to just stick this king in the corner. And black will simply shuffle between these two squares and keep black's king trapped in that corner. So let's look at how that would play out. And now we get to kind of the key position here where we force white to make a decision. If, as we were just saying, black tries to prevent, or white tries to prevent black from getting to one of these two key squares, then black just continues to shuffle back and forth, and we get into this position here, and it's a stalemate. So there's nowhere for the white king to move. Stalemate, draw. Now if we go back to this position here, white can try to play king to b6 and shove that pawn through. But when he moves his king to b6, he allows black to get on one of those key squares, and now black can just run into the corner. So that would be the first thing black would try to do in any of these positions where he's facing an opposing rook pawn. If black can just get into the corner and just sit there, it's a draw, and he doesn't have to think about it. So we get to this position here, and white has to decide. If he comes here, it's a stalemate. There's nowhere for the black king to go. And if he decides, obviously, to not fall for the stalemate, well, then black just takes the pawn. And so we have a draw. So just to kind of recap at that, from the beginning position here, black's choices when he wants to draw this position are either to make it to the corner and just sit there like we just saw at the end of that last variation, or to get control of these two squares, not let white's king get onto these two squares. These two squares are kind of like the key squares for the white king. The white king wants to get onto one of those squares without his pawn being able to be captured from the side or from behind by the black king. And if he can get on one of those two squares, then he can push the pawn through. So black wants to not allow white to get on these two key squares. So what's really interesting is I played back-to-back games where this endgame theme came up, and I was able to use it to save a half a point in one game, and in the other game, my opponent didn't realize he could create this situation for himself and save half a point, and I got the full point. So let's look at the easier of the two, and I'll kind of zip forward here. I'll go to the end and just back up quickly. So I was able to get to this position here where I trapped his king in the corner. And so all I had to do was just shuffle my king between these two squares and trap his king in the corner. Now, it was important for me to know this rule because it allowed me to play confidently earlier in the game. So let's back up and look at how this position arose from earlier in the game. So this is a position that we got to in the game. And because I knew about these two key squares and the idea of trapping his king in the corner, I could easily figure out that this was a draw. And so all I had to do was realize that, well, I have this c-pawn as a threat to shove up the board and queen. So the black king at some point is going to have to eat that pawn and then get over and eat my rook pawn. And all I have to do is while he is doing that is to get my king over here into a position like we looked at before and not let black's king get to one of these key squares and be able to push his rook pawn through. So let's just look at that real quickly. There's a number of things actually work here, but you just want to calculate from this point whether your king can get back and trap him in the corner before he can get his king to one of these two squares. And in this case, he can. You could pause it and calculate it if you want. But we see white gets there just in time. And so now this is how the game actually went. I just do not let him get to these two key squares, and he cannot win, and now it's stalemate. So I saved half a point because he had the better position, but because his extra pawn ended up being a rook pawn, he was not able to save that game. So then let's look at another game that it came up in, and I was actually black in this position. So let me flip the board around. We'll look at it from black's perspective. And let me zoom ahead here to the key position we got to in the game. So, and both of these games were played on chess.com, and I will put links to the games in the video description. And I think maybe what I'll do is I'll put a link to this Lichess study if anybody wants to look at it as a reference, and then they can see the actual games and how it played out, and then see those two like introductory positions. But we reached this position right here, and I had 2 minutes on my clock, and black had 1 minute on his clock. I'm sorry, white had 1 minute on his clock. I was black. White just resigned, and I'm sure white was thinking, well, when I grab his rook pawn, or when I grab his knight pawn, black is just going to rush over, gobble up my pawns, and I won't be able to stop his 2 pawns over on the queen side. But what's interesting is this is actually a dead draw, an absolute dead draw for white if they understand that rook pawn rule that we looked at before, and they're able to try to creatively come up with a way to steer it into a position where I am stuck with the rook pawn, and they can prevent my king from getting to these 2 key squares in front of my rook pawn. So let's look how black or how white actually could have saved this game. It's really fascinating. Here's the key move. A6. And the point of that move is that if I don't take that pawn, he's just going to take my B pawn with his A pawn and promote, and I'm going to lose. So I have no option other than to just play this move right here, just to take that pawn. And now we come into another interesting idea in pawn endgames. White can actually play C5 here, and it absolutely forces me to play king to D5. If I don't, he just pushes that pawn and he queens. So he effectively ties down my king to this pawn. He inches his king closer to the corner, closer to these 2 squares. And then he plays A5. So, I'm going to have to take here. And then he puts me in a situation where I'm going to be able to win a pawn at the end and be a pawn up, but it's going to be this rook pawn. So it's a really interesting example of this theme of king and rook pawn versus king, and just rushing the king into the corner. So now this would be dead drawn because white has already got control of these 2 squares. And this would actually be really easy for him because white can actually just run into this corner. But even if black's king were all the way up here on A3, it would still be drawn because black cannot get to these key squares. And white would be able to just stick black's king in the corner, just shuffling back and forth. But here it's even easier, like if white tries to rush to get to these squares, or black tries to rush to get to these key squares, it's kind of easy for black. For white, he just goes in that corner, and now there's nothing for black to do. We just shuffle between these 2 squares. Absolutely nothing that black can do. If he plays pawn to A2 here, it's just a stalemate. So all white has to do is hide in the corner. So I thought it was really interesting that I got these 2 games in back-to-back games where they were both decided based on this simple endgame concept. Now, this game, it was not necessarily the easiest to see that position all the way here. I understand a minute on a clock. White's not likely to see that. But maybe 10 minutes on your clock, maybe you find this resource of A6. And it's just something to keep in your mind is a lot of these endgames can be salvaged if you can force their pawn that they end up having at the end to be a rook pawn, then it opens up all kinds of more drawing opportunities because of the exception of these rook pawns. So anyway, I hope you found that interesting. I will put. I'm going to start making little videos like this. I think as things come up practically in the games that I play. I had a blitz game here just yesterday where I had a really instructive. I saved a half a point with a rook pawn, where the opponent had a rook pawn and a bishop of the wrong color, and I was able to just run my king into the corner and just move back and forth, just like White could have done here. And I think I'll make a little video on that one, and I'll start a little tiny collection of videos of easy end games, but that are very practical and actually come up in your games. And if you're aware of them, you can save a half point, which is huge. So, anyway, I hope you found that useful and have a good one.